Well, like millions of people, I've just watched Boris Johnson's announcement on BBC One, and I think it's very clear that we're in an extremely serious situation here in Britain. The virus is spreading out of control. Our health service is already buckling under the pressure, and all of the evidence suggests things are going to get worse over the next few weeks. So I think all of us can agree that very serious steps have to be taken now to slow the spread of the virus and to make sure that our health workers have the resources that they need in order to try and fight to combat it and to save as many lives as possible. But one thing I think that can be lost a little bit as we discuss what the future is going to hold is how we got to this point in the first place. And of course, Boris Johnson has been keen to say today that he's taking these measures with a heavy heart, and that, if anything, it's the fault of people who haven't been following his advice up until this point that these measures are being taken. But if you look at what happened with this virus, we have to say that the Tory government has failed dramatically. First of all, in the last few weeks, when they should have been taking much more swift and much more far-reaching measures to slow the spread, in particular doing what some other countries which have been more successful in slowing the spread have done, which is rolling out very widespread testing to huge numbers of people, not just those with symptoms, but everyone who wants a test to try and identify who has the disease and to be able to introduce very clear isolation for those individuals in order to try and stop it and contain it. That wasn't really done in Britain. We know that they could have much earlier on listened to workers, especially, for example, teachers, who were saying that it was becoming unsafe to have thousands of young people congregating in schools, that this was putting teachers themselves at risk and obviously the students and the rest of society. Teachers were saying that, and Boris Johnson was not listening. We had a situation where just over a week ago, in reality, Johnson was giving press conferences where he was telling the public that his strategy for dealing with this virus was to develop a so-called herd immunity. And what he actually meant by that, and as he explained it, was that lots of us would get sick, lots of us would contract the virus, and that therefore we would become immune to it, and that was the best way for us to proceed. And that message, very confusingly, gives people the impression that far from isolating yourself, it's almost a good thing if you go out and contract the virus. That's the kind of, very unclear messaging that came from Johnson. And of course, that went alongside, allegedly, Dominic Cummings, his chief advisor, actually saying in one of the meetings that they had to discuss this so-called strategy that, well, if a few pensioners die, too bad. That's the kind of callousness with which the Tories have actually viewed this problem. And in reality, they have chosen at every stage to delay taking measures which they think will impact on profits and on big business over delaying the spread of this virus. And that's a key reason why we're in this situation. And the other part of it has got to be said, goes back further than the last few weeks. And that is what has been happening in Britain and in many countries in Europe and elsewhere over the last 10 years, where we have had an austerity policy which has ravaged our NHS, a starvation diet in reality for the health service, a situation where going into this crisis, before a single COVID patient had been diagnosed in the UK, 94% of hospital beds were already full. So essentially no slack whatsoever built into the system to allow for any kind of emergency, let alone one of this scale. So the Tories bear an enormous amount of responsibility for getting us into this mess, and the system that they represent, capitalism, has proven itself incapable of dealing with this crisis and of preventing it from becoming a major global pandemic, which is what has happened. And now, of course, these very architects of this disaster are presenting themselves as our saviours. And Boris Johnson goes on the television to offer stern warnings to people who he is implying are irresponsible, that it's working class people, ordinary people, we're the irresponsible ones. And of course, he has been incredibly irresponsible right from the start. And that is the reason why we are where we are. Obviously, health workers now need breathing space. That means very serious measures do have to be taken. One of the founding principles of the workers' movement, perhaps the founding principle, is solidarity. And that means ordinary people looking out not just for themselves, but for everybody and for all working class people, taking seriously the health of your neighbours, taking seriously the health of ordinary people in general and of society as a whole. And that means that I think working class people generally have been some of the most self-sacrificing in the period that we've just been through with regards to this crisis. Just look at the sacrifices being made by NHS workers who've not been given a pay rise basically for about a decade. Look at the sacrifices being made by supermarket staff, not necessarily as talked about in the media and in the press, but these are people who are going to work every day in shops where thousands of people are coming through, often very stressed people, often people who are in a massive hurry, workers who are there without any protective equipment, so to speak, often without even a simple hand sanitizer, and who are going in day out to make sure that all of us can have food in our houses and can eat. So there's been huge sacrifices made by ordinary people. And that has included the vast majority of us taking very seriously the need for social distancing and those kinds of measures. But Boris Johnson today didn't just advise us to take on further social distancing. He outlined a series of quite draconian measures which can now be implemented against people who are allegedly breaking those rules that he set. Now, the first thing that I want to say about this is, of course, all of us agree we can't just go on with life as normal. All of us have to change our lifestyles in this period to protect everybody. But can we really trust Johnson, one of the people who got us into this mess, to be the one who gets us out of it? And therefore, can we really trust him with these kinds of anti-democratic powers, which is what they are? For example, one of the things that the government is now going to be able to ban is any gathering of people over 2. Now, in general, obviously, gathering in groups of people more than 2 is a very bad idea at the moment and shouldn't be done. But just look at some of the things that might include banning. I'll give you an example. In Bexley, where I live now, there have been strikes by bin workers just over the last week. Why did bin workers go on strike? They went on strike to protect the safety of themselves, but also of the wider community, because they didn't have any access to sick pay and they didn't have any access to hand sanitizer. So what was being said to them was essentially, if you've got symptoms, you're going to have to choose between potentially not being able to feed your family, not being able to pay your mortgage, not being able to live essentially, or coming into work potentially with COVID-19 symptoms and spreading the disease. And those workers took strike action in order to fight for the sick pay that they needed and the hand sanitizer and other protective measures that they needed. So they were on strike for their safety and the safety of others. Now, those gatherings of workers in order to discuss that would now be something which the police would be able to forcibly disperse. And I think that is worrying and isn't something which we should support. And I also think things like the police being able to detain anyone they suspect of carrying the virus, well, of course, that could be pretty much any of us. Again, some of these powers, we have to question how they're going to be used and whether it's really the case that Johnson is only going to use them to act in the interests of the whole of society, because I think he's shown up until this point that that's not what he really has at heart. And I think what we actually need, rather than diktats from Johnson himself, is democratic control by working class people over the measures that are taken, over how they're enforced, and over how long they last for, because that's another important question. You know, who decides when we're safe to start going outside again. I don't think that that should be down to Johnson. He's got that question wrong already in this crisis. I think that it should be people who are on the front line in the NHS. I think it should be people who are on the front line in our supermarkets. I think it should be people who are working in schools, who are really having to deal with the mess that this crisis is creating. I think those should be the kinds of people who are really able to decide whether or not it's safe to change the measures and to take different ones and so on. So I think democratic control by ordinary people is what we should be fighting for. And that brings me on to a point about what we need to do now. Because one of the things that I think this set of measures is going to do is create a sense of perhaps fear amongst some people, perhaps paranoia amongst some people. And I think we need to push past those kinds of responses and instead follow the example of the people who have already been doing the mutual aid, setting up WhatsApp groups to help people on their streets and to help older people who are having to self-isolate and so on. Follow those kinds of examples. Follow the examples of Bexley's bin workers and start trying to get organised as working class people and as people who understand the need to fight, to combat this virus and to combat the things that have caused the crisis that has resulted from it. This wasn't about the biological properties of coronavirus. This is about the way our society works. So that means getting organised. And of course, the way we do that has to be responsible, needs to be online to a large extent, needs to be things like what's been organised for tomorrow night, which is a collective clap for health workers where everyone does it from their home. Those kind of ideas, innovative ideas for how we get organised in this era of social distancing. But that's exactly what we need to do. So I want to invite you along to a meeting, which is online, of Socialist Alternative, a rally, which is going to be held at the end of this week on Friday. There's a link at the bottom to the Facebook event. Please come along to it. We're going to be discussing how we got here, what we need to do next, and how we get out of this crisis and move to a fairer society. But there's one thing's for sure, we can't allow things to go back to normal after all of this. Health workers who are risking their lives in many cases to save ordinary people deserve better than that. We deserve better than that. So please do come along. It's the Socialist Alternative online rally. Hope to see you there.